Welcome to a new series on a critical mind. Today, we are beginning a deep dive analysis of one of the most successful bridges between high science and ancient spirituality, the framework of Deepak Chopra. This isn't just about wellness. It's about a specific intellectual proposition that the findings of modern physics don't just complement spiritual insights, but actually confirm them. We're going to look at the context of this project and the core proposition that attempts to unify the laboratory with the lotus. Deepak Chopra is a unique figure in the modern intellectual landscape. A physician by training who transitioned into a global wellness authority, his brand is built on a very specific synthesis, blending Indian Vedantic philosophy with the language of Western science. He isn't just speaking in metaphors, he is claiming a literal intersection. In this slide, notice the visual representation, a body divided between biological circuitry and spiritual energy. This duality is what Chopra seeks to collapse, arguing that the mind, the body, and the quantum field are essentially different expressions of the same underlying reality. To understand Chopra's framework, we have to look at his two snakes metaphor. On one side, we have empirical science, an objective, material universe governed by mathematical physical laws and subatomic interactions. On the other, we have metaphysics, the subjective experience generated by consciousness, or what he calls a universal field of pure awareness. Chopra's central claim is that these two are endlessly consuming each other. He suggests that what physicists call a field is actually what the sages called awareness. By equating these terms, he attempts to give spiritual concepts the weight of empirical proof. In this section, we move from the context to the specific claims. It is here that the logic of a critical mind must be most precise. Chopra doesn't just say spirituality is nice. He makes ontological claims about the nature of being. We are going to examine the what was said portion of his lectures, focusing on how he redefines matter, energy, and time, not as physical constants, but as psychological outputs. One of the most foundational pillars of this framework is the concept of Maya, or the illusion. From this perspective, matter, energy, and space-time are not independently real. Instead, the physical world is seen as an appearance that exists only within awareness. Think of it like a subatomic particle. In standard physics, it's a wave function of probabilities. In Chopra's metaphysics, that wave function is a thought in the mind of the universe. If there is no observer, he argues, there is no thing being observed. Here we see the hierarchy of reality as Chopra constructs it. At the very top, the widest part of our inverted pyramid is pure consciousness, the substrate. Below that, we have the mind/body cosmos, and only at the very tip do we find matter and Maya. This is a total reversal of the materialist view. In a standard scientific view, matter creates mind. In Chopra's view, consciousness is the fundamental substrate of lived reality, and everything else, including the stars and your own biology, is a secondary ripple within that field. This is where the terminology gets pan-roasted. Chopra equates the quantum field of physics with the consciousness field of direct experience. He argues that just as matter arises from excitations in a deeper quantum field, our thoughts and physical reality arise from excitations in a deeper field of awareness. By using the term quantum excitations, he provides a bridge for the modern listener to accept the ancient idea of a universal mind. It's a powerful rhetorical move, but we must ask, is the math of the field actually the same as the feeling of awareness? If consciousness is the substrate, then the world we see is a projected reality. Chopra uses the metaphor of an internal projector. Awareness is the light source, the act of perception is the lens, and the world, Maya, is the image projected onto the screen. In this model, the world is not out there as an environment we inhabit, but an output of our own internal processing. You aren't in the world is in you. Chopra also reimagines the multiverse theory. In standard physics, the multiverse might involve physical universes splitting due to quantum decoherence. In Chopra's decision tree of awareness, the multiverse is a psychological branching of choices and experiences. Every choice you make is a collapse of the wave function, creating a new experiential reality. This turns a complex mathematical hypothesis into a tool for personal empowerment and manifestation. If we each project our own reality, why do we all see the same mountain or the same chair? Chopra's answer is the universal field. We see the same world because our individual minds are like branches of the same root system. We participate in a shared universal field of consciousness. This shared reality exists at the threshold of perception, where the individual I meets the cosmic we. In a modern twist, Chopra has integrated artificial intelligence into this path. He suggests that I can become part of the ladder toward elevating human awareness, moving from basic survival to emotional connection, creativity, and eventually cosmic consciousness. He views AI not as a threat, but as a digital mirror that can help us process our own digital dharma more efficiently. Finally, we see the rhetorical fortress Chopra has built. It is a closed loop, matter as illusion, quantum projections, and shared digital dharma. By defining the universe as an output of the mind, any scientific discovery, from quantum fields to AI, is instantly absorbed as just another projection of cosmic consciousness. It is a philosophy that is strategically designed to be impossible to scientifically disprove, precisely because it refuses to play by the rules of objective falsification. Having established the grand architecture of Deepak Chopra's metaphysics, we must now pivot to the most vital part of any intellectual inquiry, the stress test. In this section, we transition from observation to evaluation. We aren't just looking at the what anymore. We are looking at the how. Specifically, we are going to expose the structural weaknesses that threaten the stability of this entire closed-loop system. This is a clinical teardown. Our goal is to perform a rigorous logic and scientific attribution review. When a framework claims to explain the very nature of reality, it cannot be allowed to hide behind poetic vagueness. We will subject these claims to a diagnostic audit, inspecting the systemic flaws, the internal contradictions, and what I call the paradox of borrowed authority, the strange habit of using the tools of the physical world to argue that the physical world doesn't exist. The foundation of Chopra's entire project is a strict monism, the idea that consciousness is the one and only fundamental stuff of reality. To survive our audit, this framework must pass 3 critical tests: logical consistency, does it contradict itself? Scientific accuracy, does it respect the math of the theories it cites? And biological viability, can it explain the raw mechanics of survival? If a framework asserts that physical reality is an illusion, its internal mechanics must be flawless. We have identified 7 critical structural failures we are about to inspect. This is the first and perhaps most fatal logical loop. Chopra explicitly denies the independent existence of a physical reality, yet he consistently borrows the vocabulary of quantum physics to explain his model. Here is the paradox. Quantum physics is a description of the physical world. It deals with particles, fields, and excitations. Using a physical theory to validate the non-existence of a physical world is a self-defeating maneuver. It is like using a map of a city to prove that the city itself is an imaginary projection. A primary failure in this framework is the lack of a precise definition. Consciousness is left as a vague, all-encompassing term. By omitting physical triggers, the light hitting an eye, the sound waves hitting an ear, the neural mechanisms processing those signals, the framework fails to account for the diversity and specificity of human experience. If consciousness alone generates everything, why is my experience of an apple so consistent and distinct from your experience of an orange? Without physical mechanisms, the experience pathway is broken. We must address the redefined field paradox. In physics, a quantum field is a mathematical construct governing subatomic states. In Chopra's metaphysics, it is repurposed as awareness itself. This isn't just a metaphor, it's a blurring of categories. By equating a physical field with a subjective state of being, the framework introduces a profound inconsistency. You cannot use the scientific prestige of quantum fields to support a theory that rejects the very physical universe those fields are designed to describe. The reality as an image model falls apart when we look at biology. Chopra suggests we function like an AI imagining an apple, purely digital or mental data. But this ignores survival processes like digestion, metabolism, and pain. If consciousness alone creates everything, why would it bother generating such complex, involuntary, and often painful bodily mechanisms just to sustain a projection? If I am only imagining an apple, why does my biological body require the actual caloric intake of that apple to survive? This is a classic categorical error. Scientific multiverse theory involves cosmological branching based on quantum decoherence. Chopra hijacks this term, redefining it as awareness branching into personal choices. While saying infinite in every finite experience is poetic, it is factually misapplied. Substituting cosmological origins with psychological decision-making isn't just an interpretation. It's a misuse of scientific authority to bolster a psychological self-help concept. If we each create our own reality, we run into three massive mechanical issues. First, the communication gap. There is no explained mechanism for how two separate projections sync up to see the same object. Second, the free will paradox. If a collective field dictates the reality, individual choice is effectively erased. Finally, personal variation. The model fails to explain differing perceptions, such as blindness or intelligence, if a uniform, shared collective field is the only thing projecting our reality. The introduction of AI as a spiritual guide creates an immediate system tension. If Chopra's monistic claim is true, that only human consciousness is real, then AI, as a physical construct of silicon and code, cannot act as a spiritual partner. By accepting AI as a real entity capable of elevating awareness, Chopra shifts agency away from his consciousness alone pillar, directly undermining his own foundational logic. To see the pattern clearly, we have created a lexicon matrix. Note how quantum field shifts from a physical governing field to consciousness itself. Multiverse shifts from distinct universes to poetic psychology, and consciousness shifts from a biological state to a foundational generator. In each case, the diagnostic flaw is the same: the omission of sensory, biological, and physical triggers in favor of a borrowed authority that the framework simultaneously denies. Ultimately, we arrive at the paradox of borrowed authority. Chopra's system is fundamentally trapped in a cycle of dependency. It denies physical reality to elevate consciousness, yet it remains entirely dependent on the vocabulary, authority, and phenomena of physical science to sustain its own logic. This is the moment of framework collapse. You cannot cut off the branch of physicalism while you are still using its prestige as your only support. We now enter the final phase of our analysis, the deep logic behind the claims. Having identified the specific weaknesses in isolation, we now look at how they interact to create what I call the illusion of coherence. We are moving beyond the surface-level marketing to the underlying philosophical engine, and specifically, where that engine begins to smoke under the pressure of logical scrutiny. The title of our study, The Illusion of Coherence, is chosen deliberately. To a casual listener, the framework appears unified and sturdy. However, once you apply the lens of critical deconstruction, you see a significant friction between three distinct domains: quantum physics, metaphysics, and the raw data of human experience. These three are not in harmony. They are in a state of constant, unresolved tension. This is the central ontological failure of the model. Chopra aligns himself with the concept of Maya, the assertion that the material world is fundamentally an illusion. Yet he simultaneously invokes quantum theory, a rigorous empirical framework built on the observation of the physical world, to validate his claims. This creates an irreconcilable tension. You cannot use the prestige of a physical science to dismiss the existence of the physical world. It is a paradox, using the very tools of the illusion to prove that it is an illusion. In this framework, the term consciousness is used as a placeholder for mystery. By claiming consciousness is the sole substrate of reality, Chopra effectively ignores the physical mechanisms that shape our lives: sound waves, light waves, and molecules processed through neural pathways. This vagueness prevents any rigorous analysis or falsification. If everything is consciousness, then nothing is specifically explained. It is a circular logic that collapses the distinction between an objective trigger and a subjective experience. Here we witness a classic case of semantic rebranding. The quantum field of physics, a mathematical description of the substrate of particles, is repurposed as a consciousness field. This blurs the line between science and metaphor. While it attempts to merge them as complementary aspects of reality, it actually sacrifices scientific clarity for rhetorical flourish. It oscillates between monism, only consciousness exists, and dualism, using fields to describe consciousness, never settling on a stable foundation. One of the most profound explanatory voids in this model is the reduction of reality to mere images projected in awareness. This framing strips away the dynamic, multimodal interactions between a living body and its environment. An image can represent an apple, but it cannot perform the function of an apple. Biological survival, digestion, appetite, pain, and immune response cannot be reduced to mere imagery. There is a physical reality to survival that a purely mental model simply fails to account for. This is perhaps the most egregious example of semantic hijacking. The scientific multiverse is a cosmological model involving distinct physical branches of existence. Chopra redefines this as awareness branching into choices. This poetic framing lacks any explanatory depth regarding the actual mechanics of decision-making. It collapses the vital distinction between ontology, what actually exists in the universe, and phenomenology, how a choice feels to the person making it. To explain why we all see the same objects, Chopra posits a collective consciousness. However, this creates a double bind. If reality is created by my individual mind, we lose shared consistency. How do we see the same apple? But if the collective field creates it, my individual reality is imposed from the outside, which strips me of my autonomy and free will. The model collapses into vagueness, unable to explain how a unified field allows for the vast personal variations we see in human perception. The inclusion of AI as a spiritual guide is the final blow to the consciousness-only ontology. If only consciousness is real, how can a physical tool built of silicon chips and algorithms have any causal efficacy in the spiritual realm? By introducing digital dharma, the system becomes inadvertently dualistic. It admits that a physical, external technology can affect the internal state of awareness. The foundation that the physical world is an illusion instantly collapses. We have reached the end of our audit. What remains is not a bridge between science and spirituality, but a pattern of semantic rebranding. By tracing the core contradictions, using physics to disprove physics, ignoring biology in favor of images, and hijacking mathematical terminology, we see the anatomy of a flawed framework. The implications for the seeker are profound. If the foundation is built on a logical loop, the enlightenment it promises may be equally illusory. To summarize our findings, look at this lexicon matrix. Note the pattern. A scientific or biological reality is rebranded into a metaphysical term, which then creates an unavoidable core contradiction. Whether it is matter, the quantum field, or the multiverse, the framework consistently depends on the prestige of the very things it claims do not exist. Deepak Chopra's worldview is not a bridge. It is a pair of snakes, physics and metaphysics, endlessly consuming each other. Physics provides the authority, but the metaphysics denies the very reality that physics describes. Conversely, the metaphysics grants a sense of purity, but the empirical weight of physics constantly destabilizes it. In this cosmos, they are not partners. They leave only the spectacle of a total collapse of coherence. The result is a worldview that cannot stabilize. Physics undermines metaphysics, metaphysics undermines physics. Each depends on the other for survival, yet each destroys the other in the act of consumption. Chopra's cosmos becomes spectacle, endlessly circling, endlessly collapsing, never resolving. Welcome to the final phase of our audit. While our previous sections analyzed the specific claims of Deepak Chopra, these supplementary notes serve as a toolkit for the critical mind. We are going to deconstruct the how behind the what. By understanding these fallacies and the specific ways technical concepts are repurposed, you will be able to identify the anatomy of metaphysical rhetoric wherever it appears. Logic is the skeletal system of any argument. When the logic breaks, the entire intellectual structure collapses, regardless of how poetic the delivery may be. In this section, we are going to look at the specific fracture points where the Chopra framework departs from rigorous reasoning. These aren't just mistakes. They are strategic maneuvers designed to create a powerful, though ultimately empty, illusion of explanation. Look at this structural diagnostic. We see a framework built of modules and linkages, but on the right, the structure begins to splinter. These are the fracture points, the places where metaphysical strain causes a total disconnect from empirical reality. Every fallacy we are about to discuss acts as a failed joint in this architecture. When the load-bearing nodes of logic are compromised, the entire edifice of rhetoric falls into a heap of ungrounded speculation. The first mechanism of error is unfalsifiability. This occurs when a claim is structured so that no possible evidence could ever prove it wrong. In this model, the assertion that consciousness is the only real entity is perfectly sealed off. If you provide a scientific counterexample, the framework simply redefines it as an appearance occurring within consciousness. This creates a powerful illusion of being always right, but because it cannot be challenged, it cannot advance actual knowledge. It is an intellectual dead end. A category error happens when tools or properties from one domain are incorrectly forced onto another. Note the caliper in the cloud diagram. A caliper is a tool of precise physical measurement. A cloud, representing subjective experience, is a phenomenon of vague boundaries. By rebranding the mathematical quantum field of physics as a metaphysical consciousness field, Chopra produces systemic confusion. He is trying to measure the weight of a dream using the laws of gravitation, producing a poetic metaphor while claiming it is rigorous science. Tautology is a circular statement that merely repeats its own premise without adding any independent explanatory value. You will often hear the assertion that consciousness generates experience because experience is consciousness. This is a logic loop. The arrow points back to its own tail. These statements masquerade as profound revelations, but upon inspection, they are purely redundant. They explain nothing beyond restating the original, unproven claim in a new set of robes. This is perhaps the most common maneuver in the framework. Semantic hijacking is the strategic use of established scientific terminology while stripping the words of their rigorous meaning. Terms like quantum field and multiverse are plucked from the laboratory and repurposed purely as metaphors for human choice. This lends a false sheen of scientific authority to metaphysical speculation, actively misleading the audience into assuming these metaphors are backed by the math of empirical physics. False equivalence treats two deeply unequal or opposing concepts as if they were interchangeable. In this framework, physics and metaphysics are framed as complementary aspects of reality. However, the model simultaneously and paradoxically denies that the physical world even exists. This erases critical intellectual distinctions and forces a false harmony. It is like trying to balance a heavy lead weight against a feather of illusion. It leaves the underlying contradictions entirely unresolved. A framework enters a state of contradiction when it undermines its own foundation. Chopra's model asserts two mutually exclusive positions. First, that physical reality is a deceptive illusion, and second, that artificial intelligence, a purely physical construct of silicon and code, can act as an independent spiritual agent. A system cannot simultaneously reject the rules of the physical world and rely on physical technology to fulfill its spiritual mission. This collision destabilizes the entire metaphysical architecture. Poetic inflation involves deploying expansive, grandiose language to suggest depth without delivering functional content. Notice the ripple diagram, ever-widening circles around a tiny point of data. Phrases like infinite in every finite experience create a powerful emotional impression, but they offer no usable knowledge. It is rhetorical flourish substituted for conceptual clarity, leaving the seeker with a feeling of profundity but no actual how-to for the mechanics of reality. Finally, we have placeholder concepts. These are vague, undefined terms used to, quote, patch over fatal gaps in an explanation. For example, collective consciousness is often invoked to explain how different people share the same reality. However, the term itself is never mechanically defined. It functions strictly as a rhetorical stopgap, a question mark box, placed between two broken ends of a bridge. It provides the psychological illusion of a resolution, while leaving the mechanical problem untouched. To close our audit, we must look at the specific terms that have been repurposed. To the critical mind, words are tools of precision. In the Chopra framework, words are often used as vibe generators. In this final section, we will look at 5 key concepts and trace the divergence, the exact moment where the scientific reality is abandoned in favor of metaphysical rhetoric. In physics, the quantum field is the fundamental entity underlying particles. Particles are simply excitations within these fields. It is a mathematical reality. In metaphysics, this is rebranded as a consciousness field. The divergence occurs when Chopra strips away the measurable phenomena and mathematical constraints, turning a rigorous description of subatomic interactions into a category error where mind is simply substituted for matter. In physics, the multiverse is a cosmological hypothesis suggesting multiple physical universes exist via branching or bubble models. In metaphysics, this is redefined literally as consciousness choice branching. The divergence is an act of semantic hijacking. It takes a theory about the origin of the cosmos and repackages it as a metaphor for personal self-help, entirely stripping away the rigorous scientific grounding of quantum mechanics. In sociology, collective consciousness refers to the shared beliefs and moral attitudes that unify a society. In metaphysics, it is invoked as a literal, physical mechanism to explain how multiple individuals share the same projected reality. The divergence here is that the concept is deployed purely as a placeholder. By leaving it undefined as a mechanical process, it patches a gap in the monistic framework without actually explaining how shared experience works. In philosophy, Maya is a sound concept from Indian thought, asserting that the world of appearances is deceptive. In metaphysics, this ancient doctrine is superimposed over modern physics terminology to justify the claim that nothing physical exists. The divergence creates deep structural confusion. while the philosophical root is solid. Overlaying it with the language of empirical physics creates a systemic contradiction that the framework cannot survive. In philosophy, dharma refers to one's foundational law or path of righteousness. In metaphysics, this is extended to artificial intelligence, suggesting technology can act as an independent guide for spiritual growth. The divergence generates a fatal contradiction. Introducing AI as an independent spiritual agent actively destabilizes a consciousness-only worldview, because AI is undeniably a physical, material construct. You cannot have a spirit guide that is made of silicon if you claim silicon doesn't truly exist. We conclude with this mapping of the illusion of coherence. This framework does not fail randomly. It fails systematically. As you can see, the profound concepts on the right, the quantum field, the multiverse, digital dharma, cannot exist without the logical fallacies on the left holding them up. Stripped of semantic hijacking, category errors, and unfalsifiable boundaries, the entire metaphysical architecture collapses into what it always was: poetic metaphor masquerading as science.